know that I am God. Be still and 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 know that I am God.
Thank you to Michael Morris and Green Bouzard for setting the tone for tonight's evening. Michael is our Director of Contemporary Worship at St. Philip the Deacon, and Green is one of our beautiful musicians that plays with us every Sunday at the 11 o'clock service. Thank you again. We welcome you. Welcome to St. Philip the Deacon Restore Series. We've been expecting you, and we are so happy to share these next 5 weeks with you. I'm Susan Path, and I'm the parish nurse. If you don't know what a parish nurse does, talk to me later. How many of you this is the first time to St. Philip the Deacon? Raise your hand. It's okay. Good. Well, welcome. We really appreciate you coming. How many of you have been here for our Faith and Life series before? Great. Lots of you. Yes, and we will tell you more about that later on. There's one happening in February, and that is Pastor Tim Westemeyer is in charge of those, and they've been amazing. Okay, so St. Philip is committed to caring and healing, and we've been concerned about our community and the health of our community because it's such a messy world out there sometimes. Our goal with the Restore series is to be a pebble that starts that ripple in the pond to help the community grow. We are hoping that we will bring growth, resilience, and healing by giving you tools to help yourself to step out of habitual cycles, gain a sense of control over your emotional reactions, free you from less useful patterns of response. So unlike the flu that's going around right now, we want you to spread what you learn everywhere, to everyone you see, to your family, to your friends, to the community, so we can connect, we can share, we can calm, we can put people to sleep, and share micro moments of love and happiness. And I see all of this in all of our futures. So stay with us for the whole 5 weeks if you can. If not, it will be live streamed. It is being live streamed right now at the same time. Next week it will be at 7, and every other week it's at 6:30. You can go to our website, St. Philip the Deacon, Lutheran Church .org, and find out how to do that. So welcome. I will begin with a short little devotion. It's called Psalm 23 for busy people. And this is written by a Japanese poet. The Lord is my pace setter. I shall not rush. He makes me stop and rest for quiet intervals. He provides me with images of stillness, which restore my serenity. He leads me in ways of efficiency through calmness of mind, and his guidance is peace. Even though I have a great many things to accomplish each day, I will not fret, for his presence is here. His timelessness, his all-importance will keep me in balance. He prepares refreshment and renewal in the midst of my activity by anointing my head with oils of tranquility. My cup of joyous energy overflows. Surely harmony and effectiveness shall be the fruit of my hours. For I shall walk in the pace of my Lord and dwell in his house forever. Amen. Okay, we're all here today to hear what Dr. Henry Emmons has to say. I received a copy of Dr. Emmons' book, The Chemistry of Calm, at a parish nurse gathering that I was at, a teaching gathering. It was a couple months later, I found it on my bookshelf and started paging through it. I said, wow, this is just what we need in our community. It was a teaching tool of hope for those who experience anxiety and for their loved ones around them. As I began using it in my practice as a parish nurse. I then had the opportunity to hear Dr. Emmons speak at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Minneapolis and said, we need him here. We need him in the western suburbs. Dr. Emmons is a clinical psychiatrist who integrates mind, body, and natural therapies, mindfulness, compassion, and insights into his clinical work. Dr. Emmons developed the Resiliency Training Program, a groundbreaking regimen to relieve anxiety, restore physical and mental health at the Penny George Institute. And he is the author of The Chemistry of Joy and The Chemistry of Calm. He's the co-founder and CEO of naturalmentalhealth.com, a website offering trusted information and holistic products to help individuals of all ages build their resilience and rediscover joy. I asked Dr. Emmons tonight if there was something about him that most of us probably don't know here in the audience that I could share in public. And his last name is Emmons, and he grew up in a little town in southern Minnesota called Emmons. And I grew up in Keister, which is like in the same conference as Dr. Emmons. And so we were young children growing up very close to each other. And my grandfather actually had a Lutheran parish, small country church just outside of Emmons, where Dr. Emmons grew up. And he went to medical school at the University of Iowa. So we welcome Dr. Emmons and all the calming and all the information and the tools that he can give us today. Dr. Emmons.
In case you're wondering if it was just really great growing up in a town with your last name, it had its pluses and its minuses, I'll tell you that. So I'm here to talk a little bit tonight about resilience, as I understand it. I will say more about what that means to me, but before we get started, I just want to begin with a little bit of silliness. Probably a lot of you in this room have seen this movie, or might remember it. It was City Slickers. So old movie now, so every once in a while I'll talk to a group that has no idea what I'm talking about. But this is a movie you might remember with Billy Crystal and Jack Palance here on the screen. And the story, briefly, is that Billy Crystal was a kind of a neurotic, early middle-aged guy who just was lost and needed some help finding himself. So his friends convinced him to go to this dude ranch where they ran into Curly, played by the Jack Palance character. And he was a crusty old cowboy who didn't talk much, but he kept raising his finger and telling him that, there's this one thing. There's one thing you could do if you just knew what it was, you'd get your life together. But he would never tell him what it was. Near the end of the movie, which is what you see here, Billy Crystal has him by himself. They're riding to meet the rest of the crew, and he's badgering him as only he can do. He's finally broken him down, and he's going to reveal the one thing you can do. And then Curly has a heart attack and dies, so he doesn't get it out of him. I am telling you that if I make it through the next hour or so, I am going to reveal to you the one thing that you can do. Margaret Mitchell, who some of you might recognize, she wrote Gone with the Wind. This quote is attributed to her. She said, "Every problem has two handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear, or the handle of hope. I really love this quote. And I want to use this to ground us in our conversation this evening, because we are going to be talking about a problem, a real problem, a problem with depression, stress, anxiety. And I really do want to keep bringing us back to grabbing this by the handle of hope. So first, let's talk a little bit about the problem. In my view, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that we, human beings living in this time in history and this part of the world, we are struggling with a lot of different things, that there has been what I consider to be this breakdown in resilience. And one piece of evidence I just want to point you toward, 100 years ago, there were scientists who are called epidemiologists. They study large populations and their health. And they began a study in the United States that they have done every 10 years since 1910. So it's with the US Census. There's a study looking at the mental or emotional health and well-being of people in our country. And what they have found is that every 10 years when they do a survey of people in the United States, the rates of things like depression and anxiety have gone up by about another 10%. So every 10 years, 10% greater rates of depression and anxiety. So that means over this last 100 or 110 years, the rates have gone up way more than 100%. It's a sort of an exponential curve. Another way to think about this is that Martin Seligman, who some of you might know, he's known for something called positive psychology. I think you're going to have a speaker on that later. But Martin Seligman says, if you're born after World War II, your chances of becoming depressed in this country are about 10 times greater than if you had just been born around 1900. Something has changed, we believe, in the last, say, 50 to 70 years. I'm going to talk about what I think those things are, but let's just say right now that something has changed, and it's putting a downward pressure on people and their mood and their resilience. A lot of people don't know this, but depression ranks as the #1 cause of disability in the United States, and it has for a long time. So we're not talking just mental health problems, we're talking all health problems. Depression is the primary reason why people become unable to work. That has been true in the US and other developed countries for quite some time, but in the rest of the world, the more developing world, it has not been the case. It's been much, much lower. However, that is changing very rapidly. So the World Health Organization predicts by the year 2025, they think depression will be the #1 cause of disability worldwide. Over the course of my career now, for 30 years, I've been practicing psychiatry, and I have done a lot of work in small colleges, including Lutheran colleges. And there's a very clear trend that you may know about. It's not just around Minnesota, it's around the country. A very clear trend upward in terms of students who are really struggling with things like anxiety and other stress-related problems. Very high percentages now. In the last, I would say, maybe 15 years or so, the numbers of students coming into college already on medication has gone through the roof. Through the roof. And not just for a few months, but for oftentimes for a few years, even before they hit college. See if I can get this to move. One thing that we do in Minnesota pretty well, I think, compared to other states, is that we are always trying to improve the way that we deliver health care. And there is a website that's devoted to tracking this improvement. It's called MinnesotaHealthScores.org. And they're looking at depression. They look at a few other conditions too, but they are looking at depression and looking for how effective are we as a healthcare organization, how effectively are we treating this condition we call depression. And here's what it shows. These numbers are really, really disconcerting if you're in the field. There's 115 clinics participating. We're talking primary care clinics. We're not talking mental health. This is if you go to your family doctor or your nurse practitioner and you tell them that your mood is bad. In fact, probably a lot of you have, if you've been recently, you've had to fill out a short questionnaire. It's 9 questions. I went in for a shoulder problem and they asked me to fill it out. They're just doing it as a screening test. It's 9 questions. It's called the PHQ-9. And it's meant to try and find anybody who might be suffering from depression so that they can be offered treatment. But what is the treatment that's offered, do you suppose? By and large, it is a medication. And so that's what these results are looking at. How well does that treatment work in these primary care settings? 10 out of these 115 clinics have a rate of remission of about 25%, 23 to 29%. Only 10. The average across all clinics is about an 8% rate of recovery, full recovery, with this kind of treatment. This is not working. 8% is a very poor number, very poor. When I was in my training, we learned that before any kind of medication treatment was available for depression, if nothing was done and you just let the illness run its course, in about 6 to 12 months, roughly 40 to 50% of people would have recovered if nothing was done. Here, what we're seeing is that doing something, offering a medication, we're seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 8 to 30%. Less than if we did nothing. I think there's something wrong with this measure or with the definitions they're using. I don't believe the numbers are this bad, but I do believe that the numbers are bad. And I think one lesson from this is that depression, anxiety, these stress-related problems, they are very complex things. They are not simple serotonin imbalance or some other kind of brain chemical imbalance. That might be part of it, but that's not all of it. One thing that this doesn't show us is that when people go in, let's say to a primary care clinic, and they say that their mood is bad, what percentage of those people do you think actually have what we would consider clinical depression, major depression? 100 people go in and they're all reporting the same kind of symptoms. I think only about 20% have what we call clinical depression. What do the rest of them have? They have a stress-related problem that is known as an adjustment disorder. It feels like depression, it looks like depression, but it is caused by an imbalance in the stresses in one's life compared to that person's ability to respond to those stresses. So that's really what resilience is about, is we're looking at how do we help people respond better, more effectively to the stresses in their life, because stress is not going away. Stress is not new. We didn't invent it in the last 50 to 70 years. It might be different, but it's definitely not a new problem. I think we can do better than this. I think we have to recognize that these are more complex, more sophisticated kind of solutions are needed, and people need to know, or they want to know, what can they do for themselves so that they're not relying just on a single treatment that doesn't work for everyone. Susan mentioned that a few years ago, after my first book came out, I was invited to start a program that we called Resilience Training. That program is still going. I do it in my own practice in a slightly different way. But it is a means of trying to offer skills-based training, trying to teach people things they can do for themselves that boost their resilience level. And basically, we're doing these 3 things. We're adding really sound nutritional advice. I'll say a little bit more about that later. We're adding fitness or movement, some kind of way of getting the body moving again. And then we're teaching people to use mental and emotional skills that fall under the umbrella of what's known as mindfulness practice. awareness practices. Basically, it's getting really simple but effective mental and emotional skills so that you can face whatever is in front of you and be able to do it more skillfully. We did this program in a series of groups, of 8 to 10 week groups. We're teaching skills, we're not doing psychotherapy. And we take somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 people in a group. And this is what we found. We did a study when I was at the Penny George Institute, a study with employees. So these are healthcare employees. Why did we do this study? Because Alina, who owns the Penny George Institute, Alina is a very big organization. They have to pay their own healthcare expenses. They're self-insured. And they know, because they get these numbers, they know that every single year, treating depression for their own employees is the number 1, 2, or 3 most expensive condition of all, for all of their own employees. So healthcare, of course, healthcare practitioners are not immune to this. We get these things too, just like everyone else. In fact, maybe a little bit more so because of all the pressures people feel themselves to be under these days. But here's what we did. We took 2 groups of people, 20 people per group. One group waited for about 6 months before they went through. The other group went through right away. And so the group that waited was considered the control group, if you know anything about this kind of research. I should add, before I tell you about the results, that in the first 2 weeks that we offered this program, we had 450 phone calls from employees asking to participate. We couldn't believe it. We were afraid we weren't going to get enough people to do this study. We could only take 40 people, and we had 10 times that many, which I think tells us something about how common this is and how much people are looking for a different way to do it. So I'm only going to show you, we had a number of things we measured, but I'm going to show you the same test that I referred to earlier, this 9 questions about depression called the PHQ-9. And what we're seeing here, the 2 groups, the kind of reddish and yellowish or green, those 2 groups were the treatment groups. The blue group was the control group. In other words, the group that was waiting to take the course. And what you see is that the 2 treatment groups improved dramatically. Their scores went from about 10 or 12 down to less than 4. And if you remember from the previous slide, anything under 5 is considered to be complete remission. Every single person, all 40 people who did this improved. They didn't all reach this level that we consider complete remission, but most of them did. And nearly everybody improved without using any medication whatsoever. We didn't add medications in this study. Seem to have lost the slides. If Susan is around, maybe I'll... Oh, there we go. All right, so what is resilience? I use this image here, this water cooler image, as just a visual to talk about it. To me, resilience means the capacity to face whatever is in front of you, no matter how stressful, to be able to get through it more or less intact. And if you do get knocked down by it, you can get back up again. If you get knocked down again, you can get back up again. And again, it doesn't mean that life is not stressful. It means that one is really capable of dealing with that stress, no matter what it is. Now, the reason I use this image of a container is I imagine inside each of us there is something like this that has an elixir that keeps us resilient. If you have enough of this liquid in your container, you're able to face whatever's coming your way. If it gets too low, the quantity gets too low, then you're in trouble. Now, people have different size containers. We do have different capacities, mainly for 2 reasons. One is Genetics, of course. Some people are born lucky in a family that's just really healthy, really emotionally hardy, really resilient. And then the second factor, which we also don't have much control over, is what's that environment like when you grew up? When you were a young child, how much nurturing, how much love, how much caring and support? That makes a huge difference as one goes through life. And it can be, either of these things can be dealt with, but they're pretty hard to change fundamentally. So we've got to be thinking about what we can do, helping, really early in life, helping the kids to have at least a less stressful, less chaotic, somewhat more supportive environment is going to be hugely helpful for them throughout their lives. But I also use this to point out that it matters less how big your capacity is than it does how well are you keeping yourself filled up. So in other words, I see a lot of patients who, by birth or early childhood, they got a pretty small container. And they're very susceptible to these things we're talking about. But if they find the right key to keep this filled up, they're able to stay just as healthy, feeling just as good as the person who's got the great big capacity. On the flip side of it, there are people who you all know, maybe you're someone who falls in this category, who by nature is really resilient. But you go through a really tough stretch sometime in your life, typically somewhere in the middle of life. Maybe you've got kids that you're really worried about because they're not doing well or they're getting in trouble in some way. Maybe you've got parents who are aging. Maybe your marriage isn't going well, your job, any number of things. But if there's 3 or 4 of these things that come together in a period of just a few years, anybody can get depleted. So again, the big question is, are we able to keep ourselves filled up? And the rest of my comments, I'm going to talk about things I think help to keep us filled up. I want to talk about it by using these 3 core aspects of science as it relates to mental health. The first is genetic expression. What this means basically is that while you cannot change your DNA, you have a lot to say about whether those genes become activated or not activated. So we might have a gene or a series of genes that promote something like depression, but it may never get turned on unless the conditions are right for turning that on. So in other words, genes can be turned on and create an illness. They can also be turned off and help that illness to subside. This is really key. This is something that we're just beginning to tap into in terms of medical understanding. But I like thinking about it this way because it recognizes even something like genetics can be altered in some way. It can be influenced by choices that we make in our lives. Here are some of the things we know about. You know about these yourself already. Some of the things that activate illness are things like alcohol and tobacco, endocrine disruptors, and that means things that impact our own hormones. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them in the environment, a lot of them in our food, in our water. Plastics are an example. Hormones in milk or other foods is another example. Antibiotics used in animals. All of these things can affect our own well-being through our hormones. And then the effects of long-term stress. There's also some positive things. These are things that will help keep illness genes turned off, or even if they've been activated, it may help turn them off again. And those are bright colors, phytonutrients. They're the bright colors in fruits and vegetables. Exercise, which I'm going to say what kind of exercise I'll tell you in a little bit. And then cultivating positive emotions. So it's not just that we are prone to negative emotions through long-term stress. There are things we can do, purposely to create more positive emotions in ourselves. I want to talk more about that later because it's so, so important in this. So the first root of resilience is to help balance brain chemistry through diet. If we can start with diet and then maybe go to some nutritional supports like vitamins and minerals and amino acids, and then maybe go to medication if that's needed. But starting with diet will always help. It will never make things worse if diet moves in a healthy direction. So if you read about diet today, in today's world, if you go on the internet and you start reading or you go to the bookstore, it is incredibly confusing because you can read exact opposite recommendations from experts and they have studies and everything else. You don't know what to do. I'm pretty well versed in this stuff and I can read and find it very confusing knowing what to do. A lot of you are familiar with this author, Michael Pollan. He wrote a book a few years ago called In Defense of Food. And after that book came out, someone challenged him because all this nutritional advice is so complex and so confusing. They challenged him to summarize it in 7 words or less. And this is what he came up with. Eat food, not too much, mostly vegetables. Pretty simple. It's actually not quite as simple as it sounds because when he says eat food, which sounds like a complete no-brainer, but when he says eat food, he means eat real food. Real food, by his definition, is food that your grandmother would have recognized as food. Hasn't been changed much. It hasn't been altered. It hasn't had things added to it or taken away from it. It is food in its natural state. Generally that you have to cook in some way. Second line here, very simple to understand, very hard to put into practice. Not too much. What this really means, and this, by the way, this is probably the single most universal finding in all of the research on diet, and that is not eating too much is the best thing you can do for your health. Especially not eating too much simple or refined sugars or carbs, because they really do make it hard for the brain if the blood sugar levels gets up a little bit, and it also makes it very hard for the hormones, the insulin and management of glucose and blood sugar. It's really difficult if we're constantly pushing it with eating too much of these things. So not too much, it is really key, and I recognize how hard it is to do. And then thirdly, mostly plants or mostly vegetables. Again, because they have so many protective things in them, including those bright colors, but also fiber. Fiber, having more fiber in our diet, again, one of probably the simple and very best things we could do for our overall health and well-being. Second thing I want to talk about is called neurogenesis. Neurogenesis means that the brain is capable of repairing itself by making new cells. So I remember learning, and I bet some of you learned this too, when you were in, let's say, high school biology. I remember learning that when you're born, you've got a lot of brain cells. I think the number is 100 billion. It's a lot of cells. And by the time you're about 8 to 12, this is what I learned, by the time you're about 8 to 12, well, the brain has pretty well finished, putting things together, and after that, it's just sort of downhill the rest of your life. Now I think people would argue it's closer to 26 to 30 that the brain is still kind of coalescing and developing. But still, you get the point that the notion is that the best we can do is hang on to what we've got for the rest of our lives. Now, there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. You know, the brain we have when we're 60 or 70 is not the same brain we had when we were 16 or 17. Thankfully, in some ways, that's a good thing. But just like a forest, you know, a mature forest doesn't have as many trees, but they're really big. They're branching like crazy. You know, the mature forest is a thing of beauty. And so is a mature brain. As long as there's enough of those cells, they do branch really broadly and richly. You don't need all of those cells. But what we didn't know until pretty recently is that the brain, just like most of the body, it can replace some of those when they're gone. So we lose cells. There's all kinds of things that happen that we lose brain cells, but at least some of them are replaced by new ones. This is especially important in the memory center of the brain, the hippocampus. That's where these stem cells live and can be turned into whatever is needed. But the real key is, does that cell survive? Does that brand new cell that comes from the stem cell, will it survive? And what are the factors that help it survive? There is a chemical, it's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, that you can think of as Miracle Grow for your brain. If any of you are gardeners, you know if you've got a really nice, new, expensive plant that you're going to put in the ground outside, it might be good to add some root starter to it. Root starter, you know, kind of like fertilizer. It makes the roots grow farther, branch out more richly, and be able to extract more nutrients. That's very much like what this does for a brand new brain cell. It causes it to branch out more richly so that it can connect with other brain cells. That's what leads to its survival. The ability to connect, you know, to kind of link up with other neurons. Now, here are the things that we know that can improve this, and you're going to see some similarities to the earlier list with genetics. Exercise. Low level, not very strenuous exercise. Now, I do have to be honest about this. This research that I'm referring to was done not with human beings, but with lab rats. And there is a very big difference between lab rats and human beings. And that is, if you put one of those treadmill circle things in a rat cage, they will actually use it. They do. They love it. You give them that circular treadmill thing, and they'll run for hours a day. Not so easy to get us to do that with our treadmills. But I'd like to think if the rat had clothing to hang on their treadmill, they wouldn't use it either. But the second thing on this list is an enriched environment. And again, this literally all was done on lab rats. And with rats, getting an enriched environment is pretty simple. You give them toys to play with. You make them learn something new and difficult that they've never done before, like a maze. And you give them playmates. I like to think it's not that different for human beings. We need toys, we need to play, we need to be challenged, and we need to be doing it with others. Now, we do need to be challenged. In order to really keep our brains healthy, especially as we age, it is really, really helpful to take on new and difficult things that you haven't mastered before. A lot of people will talk about, crosswords or Sudoku or, online games, and those are all good until you've mastered them. And then you're not getting that much out of them. So you need to keep finding something that is a little bit challenging and that kind of forces you to feel just a little bit stressed by not being able to do it right away. And then, once you solve that, or you learn that language, or you learn that piece of music or dance move, or a new route home, or something to that effect, Once you've done that, you get this relief from that little bit of stress. That is really when your brain grows and you create more of these new cells and new connections. The third thing here, you see diet shows up again, very similar to the last list. Not eating too much, they call it calorie restriction in these studies. Getting those bright colors, and then getting good, healthy omega-3 fats. Number 4 on the list is serotonin. That is the brain chemical that probably does the most to keep us feeling soothed and comfortable and happy. Having adequate amounts of serotonin turns out to be really good for these brain cells. And then social connection. Again, with rats, pretty easy. Give them another rat in the cage and they're considered to have social connection. Human beings, this is tough, but it's incredibly important. So some scientists looked at all of these things, compared them to each other, added age, because as we age, in fact, we don't make quite as many of these new brain cells. So they added these 5 things plus age. Which do you think, in this study, proved to be the most important for creating these new brain cells and helping them survive? It's social connection. Isn't that interesting? Social connection beat everything else. Literally, in the study, they had a group of old rats who got to hang out with other old rats, and they did better than the youngsters who were running and not eating too much and doing all the other things. Social connection is probably the most important thing overall that we can do for our mental health. Meaningful social connection. So the second root of resilience is to manage our energy, and managing energy is best done how? By spending energy, using it. It forces your body to become better at making more of it. And so what this is really talking about is exercise. So the Center for Disease Control gives us these guidelines. Every week, we ought to get at least 2.5 hours of moderate exercise, or if it's more intense, just 75 minutes will do. Plus, it's good to do some sort of strength training. Now remember, gardening counts as strength training, housework, light housework, yoga. Doesn't have to be going and lifting weights. So 2.5 hours a week of exercise. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm just going to ask you to think about what percentage of people in this country do you think get this much exercise? It's about 30%, 25 to 30% of adults, 2.5 hours a week. I want to tell you a story that happened to me probably about 15, maybe even 20 years ago now. I was speaking to a group, an elder hostel group at the University of Minnesota. And these were people probably mostly in their mid-70s to early 80s. They were about the age of my parents at that time. And we were having a conversation about why is depression getting more common? And I said something like this. I think I said, one reason is because life is more stressful now than it used to be. I just told my parents, people my parents' age, that they had it easier than we do now, and they very quickly corrected me. I had gray hair already, and they said things like, "Sonny," and "young man," and then they told me how difficult their lives were when they were young. Now, what was really interesting to me was that almost all their stories were about growing up on farms. Now, they all lived in the Twin Cities at that time, but most of them grew up on farms. And that really opened my eyes because they were talking about working, 8 to 10 hours a day as kids even. But it made me realize that we human beings are not meant to move our bodies for only 2.5 hours a week. We are designed, and throughout all of human history, until very recently, we have moved our bodies for hours a day. Not intensely, perhaps, at least not very often, but moving throughout the day, doing things without strapping up your tennis shoes or going to the gym that still involve really good, healthy physical movement. We're not meant to be so sedentary. I include this just referring to a study just to show how effective exercise is, just walking, as a treatment for depression. This is a study looking at people who had major depression, serious depression. They did not recover with 2 or more courses of antidepressants. And most of them were, well, I think by definition in this study, they were all over 65 years old. What they did was they divided this group of 150 people into 2. One group was told to walk, just walk, for 30 to 45 minutes a day, most days of the week. And the other group was not told to do that. The walking group, with no other difference, the walking group, 26% of them reached complete remission. 0, not one person in the other group reached remission. That's a pretty powerful study. That is a powerful intervention that costs virtually nothing. It's just walking. There's nothing fancy about this. 30 to 45 minutes a day, most days of the week. This is a picture of a Dr. Levine from the Mayo Clinic, who is the person that came up with the idea for these treadmill desks. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, you've heard about these, but these treadmill desks where you set it, you walk on a treadmill very, very slowly. It's not even like a normal walking pace, it's just a very slow pace. But you can use it as a desk so you can do it all day long. And he's done a ton of studies on this. He calls it non-exercise. Non-exercise activated thermogenesis. And the acronym for that is NEAT or NEAT. Non-exercise, he says, is incredibly helpful because it does raise your metabolism. It activates metabolism. You can lose weight even if you don't do anything else. It's also really good for your mental sharpness and for your mood. And you can get one of these treadmill desks for about $10,000, I think. Or you can learn from the research that came out of NASA a few years ago. They were really wondering, why is it that when an astronaut spends a significant amount of time in space, they come back and it seems like their body has aged greatly. They age really quickly in space. And they're wondering, are they getting hit by some gamma rays, or is there something about the diet? They're exercising. We ask them to exercise every day, but it doesn't seem to be helping. They figured out that the reason they seem to age is because they weren't exercising against gravity, or not as much gravity, right? And so, fast forward a few years, out of that research, come to realize that one of the very best things you can do for yourself, for your health, is simply to stand up. To stand up frequently throughout the day. Because you're using your whole body's weight. It takes a lot of muscle strength, a lot of effort just to stand from a sitting position. And if you do this about every 15 to 20 minutes throughout the day, you're getting a lot of the same kind of benefit that you could get from that nice, expensive treadmill desk. It's simply not being sedentary. It is moving and building movement into your day. I tried this when I wrote my last book a few years ago, and it was about staying sharp as you age, and so I came across this research, and so I set my iPhone to go off every 20 minutes. And it drove me nuts at first because I would just get into something and then I'd have to stand up and kind of disrupt myself. But after about 2 or 3 days, I got used to that. And I found I had a lot more energy, a lot more mental clarity. I was able to stay with my writing for much more of the day than I was before. It was pretty amazing, actually. So think about that just every few minutes, no matter what you're doing. Stand up, and then if you want, you can go walk somewhere, do something else, or you can just sit right back down. So somebody stood up right now. Why don't you just do it? Just stand up. You don't do this at very many talks, I know that. And whenever you're ready, you can just sit back down. I think it helps to just maybe stretch a little bit when you do that. Sometimes, bend a little. Doesn't take much. The third root of resilience I call aligning with nature. And this is where we start getting into stress. There's a book by this name, this title, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. That's the name of the book. It's a great title. It's a great book, written by a neuroscientist named Robert Sapolsky. And he says, zebras don't get ulcers, or animals in the wild don't get stress-related illnesses because they don't suffer from chronic stress. But people do. You see that motorcycle deal there? I think this was photoshopped. I'm not buying this at all. So the same guy, the author, Sapolsky, says we human beings, we have evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. Through our thinking, our worrying, our deeply held beliefs and ideas, they can make us sick through what we collectively know as stress. Now, I want to really emphasize this. Stress is not a bad thing. We are well designed to undergo stress, really, really big stress. That's not the problem. Let me just describe for you what stress is supposed to look like in the wild. So zebras don't carry chronic stress, but every once in a while, living as a wild animal is really stressful. Really stressful. So picture this, take the motorcycle away, change the animals. I'm going to describe for you a video that is used to help understand human stress and how to help people recover from it, especially really traumatic stress. So here's the picture is something kind of like the old Wild Kingdom, if you remember that. You see a herd of gazelles that are just peacefully grazing on this African savanna. And then to the left of your screen, there's a cheetah that starts running toward the herd. And if you've ever seen this, the entire herd seems to sense it at the same moment. They all crouch and they all leap and start running. And then they look like a school of fish, they're all running together. And they're really fast. These gazelles are really fast. But the cheetah is a little faster. And he has his sights set on one poor gazelle. And he catches it. He leaps onto its back, he pulls it down, has its jaws around its neck, and then the gazelle goes stiff. The entire body goes stiff. What's just happened is that you've seen the fight or flight reaction. The gazelle has fled because it can't fight against a cheetah. But fleeing didn't work. And then there's a third option that we don't hear as much about, and that is to freeze. Fight, flight, and freeze. Freeze is the very last chance to survive. It's automatic. It's a little bit like when we're kids and we're playing hide and seek and you just stay really still and you don't think anybody can see you. Except that it's just a reflex. And so you're kind of watching this, and the idea is that sometimes a predator will lose interest in an animal that seems to be dead. So sure enough, cheetah gets up, walks away, and you don't see it again. Camera stays on the gazelle, and after just 3 or 4 minutes, it starts to move, and I realize it's not dead. And then it gets up on its knees, and it's really wobbly, and kind of, trying hard to get up on all fours, and it finally makes it to all fours. And I still think, maybe it's not going to survive. But then something really strange happens. The gazelle's body, its entire body starts to shake, really violently shaking. It goes on for at least a couple of minutes. Seems like forever. Apparently what it's doing, this is nature's way to reset. It's almost like you're shutting down the computer and you're resetting it. And it is getting rid of all of those stress hormones, all of that lactic acid. It's just getting done with it. And then the shaking stops, and something even stranger happens. The gazelle walks back to the rest of the herd and starts grazing like nothing happened. That is what stress is supposed to be like for us. We're not supposed to carry it with us. We're supposed to be able to be done with it and move on to the next thing. Now, if you were to measure the stress hormones as this all happened, what you'd see is that adrenaline shoots through the roof the very moment that it senses the cheetah is in the vicinity. Shoots through the roof, but adrenaline only can last for a few minutes. You can't keep up that kind of energy and focus for very long. Then the second stress hormone, called cortisol, takes a few minutes. It takes maybe 5 to 8 minutes, and then that starts to rise kind of gradually. And in the case of this gazelle, it's going to stay elevated for about 24 hours. What is it doing during that 24 hours? What is cortisol doing for that animal? One is it's making it hungry. It makes it want to eat more, to replenish all this energy it just spent. Secondly is it's making it tired so that it will rest. So if you're watching that gazelle for the next 24 hours, basically, it'd be sleeping and eating, recovering from stress. A third thing it's doing, which you don't see, but it's really important, is that cortisol pushes the memory button. It activates the hippocampus, the memory center. Why does it do that? It's really important because you want to remember everything you can about this so that it never happens again, right? So this is all well and good for about 24 hours. But if you're carrying high levels of stress for days, weeks, months, even years, you're getting tired and fuzzy-headed, you're eating too much and too much of the wrong things, so you keep gaining weight, especially in the midsection. And then thirdly, your memory center is going haywire. It's being activated way too much, way too strongly, and that is really hard on it. Brain cells, if they're overactivated, they do not do well. They don't survive as well. I can't prove this to you because there isn't proof of it, but there is very strong correlation between undergoing a very severe stress and then about 6 months to a year later being diagnosed with some kind of dementia, like Alzheimer's. It's not as simple as saying that the stress caused it, but there does seem to be a clear correlation. One of the most important things we can do to keep resetting that stress button is to sleep. I cannot overemphasize this. I have come to see sleep as the linchpin for good mental health. I think in terms of self-care, it's the one thing that's non-negotiable. You cannot do without it and still feel good emotionally, stay sharp mentally, keep your body feeling right. Sleep is absolutely non-negotiable. If you have problems sleeping, I would put that very number one on your priority list. I would say keep focusing on it, keep getting help with it until it's improved. It's not true that we need less sleep as we age. It's just that for lots of reasons we may not get as much sleep as we age, but we still need it. Everybody needs somewhere between roughly 6 to 8 hours of sleep per night. And if it's less than that, stay with it. Learn about it. Do some things. There's a lot of information about it on my website, the Natural Mental Health website. But get good information, get good help if you need it, because it's absolutely crucial. This is something I probably don't need to say here in a church like this, although my experience is that those of us in churches aren't always good at really remembering this, and that is that a Sabbath, a day of rest, but more than that, is really important. And this author, the book is called Sabbath, you can't read it very well, but it's by Wayne Muller. He says Sabbath is more than the absence of work. It is time consecrated with our attention, our mindfulness, listening deeply to what is most nourishing. There's wisdom in that we as a society have very foolishly given away. Lastly, I want to talk about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain is changing all the time. Whether we know it or not, we are creating pathways in our brains for good or for ill. And it's happening throughout our lifetimes. It never stops. We never stop creating new neural pathways. Let me give you an image for this. Imagine that you are standing in front of a grassy meadow, long, tall grass. Nobody has walked across it before. And then you walk across it one time only. If you turn around, you can very faintly see where you've walked, but if you don't do it again, that path is going to disappear. That is very much like what happens the very first time that we learn something new, or we have a new emotional reaction to something, or we have a thought that we might play through in our heads. The first time it happens, it hasn't yet created a solid path. But then imagine that you keep walking that same path every day, maybe multiple times a day. You just go right down that same path. Before too long, it is very clearly a path. Anybody can see it. Anybody who comes to this meadow is going to see that this is the path I should probably take. That's very much like what happens, let's say the very first time somebody has an episode of depression that they've never had before. They've created a neural pathway, and it's easier in the future to go down that same pathway. Same thing, if you've had a really negative thought about yourself, and you keep replaying that thought again and again and again, you are just creating a trench across this meadow. Imagine then that you have realized you've created this path and you don't want it anymore. So you stop walking across this meadow. It takes a while, but it will start to disappear. And if you give it enough time without continually recreating it, that pathway is, for all intents and purposes, it's gone. Now, it could still be kind of brought back to life pretty quickly if you wanted to. It's still there, but it's not very visible. So this is what happens if, for example, in therapy, if you realize that you've been harboring these negative thoughts about yourself, or maybe it's your spouse or someone else in your life, and you just keep thinking that same thing again and again, and then you decide you're not going to do that. Easier said than done, but it is possible to do that if you have awareness of it and you have a strong enough intention to not keep watering or keep walking on that path. It will eventually go away. Now there's a flip side to this too. Imagine that there's a path that you really want in your life that you don't currently have. Maybe you want to be a more generous person. Or maybe you want to be more compassionate to others, or have more gratitude. Some of these qualities that we know are good for us, we don't have to just rely upon them happening on their own. Those can be practiced, and they can be developed as a good, strong pathway, at least as as much as some of these more negative things can. But they will not happen without our intention and purposely learning to develop these new ways of thinking and feeling. So the fourth root of resilience is to calm the mind. And these are the very opening lines of an ancient spiritual text called the Dhammapada. The lines are, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. The power of the mind. I want to tell you one study just to illustrate the power of the mind to create something new. This is a study looking at what happens when you use fingers of one hand, to play a song on a keyboard. So the researchers were looking to see if doing this, if practicing a song with just one hand would have an impact on the size of the brain, the part of the brain that controls movement of the hand. So you only did one hand so they could compare. So they looked at, they did this only for 2 weeks. They had a group of young people practice a song right-handed, 2 hours a day for 2 weeks. And then they measured the size of the brain on the left part of the brain to see if it changed. Well, it did change. It grew about 25 to 30% bigger just by practicing this hand movement for 2 weeks. Now that's kind of to be expected. It's very much like what would happen if you picked up a dumbbell and you wanted to make your right arm stronger, and you did this, let's just say 20 times a day for 2 weeks. You're going to have bigger muscles in your right arm. But then they did something really interesting. They asked another group of volunteers to do the same thing with one very big difference. They said, don't actually move your fingers. Just imagine it. So this is taking place purely at the level of thought. They had the exact same growth in the part of the brain that deals with movement, even though they did not move their hand. Now, some of you are thinking right now, hey, this is good news. This means I don't actually have to exercise. It's not what it's saying. It's just telling us how powerful and important our thoughts are. We really do want to be able to learn to recognize them, to have a little more say over what's going on, because we are thinking all the time. So the fifth root of resilience is to learn to face difficult emotions. This is a line by Rilke that I just love. He says, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Now, if you're in the midst of something like depression, it's hard to convince yourself that no feeling is final, because it feels like it's going to be there forever. Now, this is an image that explains a really important aspect of mindfulness, which is that suffering is inevitable, but there's more to it than just the pain or the suffering in our lives. And that's where we need to start to get some leverage. So the image you see here is of an ancient warrior kind of batting away arrows. And if you can imagine being a warrior back in the day, if you're out in the battlefield, there's a good chance you're going to get wounded, that you're going to get hit. It's very much like us living life, being out there in life. We're going to get hurt. There is just no way around that. That is what's known as the first arrow, and it's inevitable. We do the best we can to avoid it, but it's not something we can avoid altogether. Imagine then, after being struck by an arrow in battle, imagine that the soldier takes a second arrow out of his own quiver and stabs it into himself. That's known as the second arrow, and this is what we do to ourselves when we react really strongly or really negatively to that first wounding. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was working with a college student, a young freshman, and she saw me early in the year because she was on medication, but she was doing great, no problem. She was making friends. She was feeling really good about being in college. 1 week later, I get an emergency call from her therapist saying, you've got to see her. She's suicidal. She's really depressed. So I saw her 1 week later. And I said, what happened? You were doing so well. And this is what happened. Sometime during that week, some of her new friends, people she thought were friends, went from their dorm to dinner, and they didn't invite her to join them. That is what happened. Now that's a wounding, right? That does hurt. It doesn't feel good to be left out. That's the first arrow that she has a right to feel badly about. But then, her reaction to that is what really caused the damage. Because she took that one thing, which could have been just an oversight, they just may not have been thinking, but she ran with it, and she started believing that they don't like her, that they excluded her purposely because she's unlikable, she doesn't have friends, she's never going to have friends. And then the really big thing, the big fear was her mother had depression that was untreatable, she wasn't getting better, and this girl feared that that was her future, that she was going to have that problem. So all of this happened because she was left out of going to dinner. Now, each of us has some example of something like that. Maybe it's not quite that dramatic, but something like that, where it's not the first thing that causes so much of the pain. It is what we do, we ourselves do, in reaction to that first thing. And that's where we need to learn to do it differently, to get some leverage over that. There is a built-in natural bias to look for what's wrong. It's built into our brains, probably because our ancestors, there was so much danger in their environment. If they missed it, if they didn't see something that was wrong, they could really be in trouble. Nowadays, we don't have that exact same kind of danger or stress, but we are just constantly drawn to see what's wrong. What's wrong with our environment? If I feel badly, why do I feel badly? It must have been something I did. It must have been something somebody else did in my life. We look for a cause, we find it either externally or internally, blame ourselves, but we're always drawn to what's wrong. And so we have to purposely try to do something to counter that. So the sixth root of resilience is to cultivate a good heart. This is a great way to counter that. Practicing compassion is an excellent way to counter some of the negative feelings that we might carry around. This is a study that if you see that National Geographic picture, some of you might remember this, just a few years ago, they were studying monks, Buddhist monks, at the University of Wisconsin. And they asked them to do a very simple thing. They showed them a picture of a little baby who was born with a deformity on its skull. And they said, this is a suffering being. Fill yourself with compassion for this child. And they could do it. They'd see the picture, and they'd close their eyes within moments. They're so filled with this state of compassion that it was measurable on these brain scans. They're measuring something called the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead, where the area of the brain that some people would say is what makes us most human. And one of the aspects of this is that it's maybe where the compassion center is, on one side. So you can measure if the left side is more active, you're in a state of openness, compassion, loving kindness. If the other side is more active, it's kind of the opposite. You're in a state of contraction or maybe hostility or self-preservation. It's not that one is good and the other is bad, but I can tell you, I can guarantee you the emotions feel better if you're in that state of openness. And if you're constantly being drawn toward the negative, this is a really good antidote for it. So after finding out how great these monks were at doing this, they took a group of people, maybe much like us in this room, people who had never done this kind of training or practice. It's a specific kind of a meditation. And they asked them to do the same thing, and then they measured, and nothing happened. There was no change. But then they gave those people a bit of training, just for a very few weeks. I think it was just 4 weeks of training, just a few minutes a day, practicing holding someone with compassion in your own heart. And then, after just a short time, they were able to shift into this state of openness, loving kindness. And again, it feels a whole lot better. One of the most painful things a lot of people will describe about being in a state of depression is this constant rumination. Just turning over the same thoughts about usually negative thoughts about yourself again and again. And it's such a relief if you can get out of that sort of self-absorbed thinking. It's just a huge relief. This is a way to actively practice that, getting out of that. And then finally, the seventh root of resilience is to create deep connections. Again, going back to those studies on the brain science, connections are probably the most important thing. I like to think of it broadly, not just being with other people, but being really connected deeply to yourself, being connected to something that really gives you a sense of meaning, being connected to something that feels greater than yourself, which really is the stuff of religion, the stuff of spirituality. So what does everyone want? The Dalai Lama, who teaches and espouses meditation and religious practice, he says we can live without religion and meditation, but we cannot survive without human affection. So I promised you I would share the one thing that we can do. And this is it. This is a quote by a guy named Mark Van Doren, who is no longer living, I don't think, but it was written in the 1940s or 50s. He said, "There is one thing we can do, and the happiest people are those who can do it to the limit of their ability. We can be completely present. We can be all here. We can give all our attention to the opportunity before us." So, thank you for your attention, for your presence. You have been a very attentive audience. I think Susan's going to come up, and there is some time for a Q&A. So please, if you're interested, I think there's mics on both sides. You can just come up so that everybody can hear.
There, green light. Okay, I'll just give Dr. Emmons a couple minutes to rest his vocal cords. And there are 2 mics, one on each side. If you have any questions, you guys can start lining up there while I go through a few little homework or housekeeping things at the very end. So if you have a good question, he'll be happy to answer it. First of all, the binders. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the binders. His 7 roots of resilience are under calm in here. So the green tab at the beginning has his 7 roots, and there's also another page in there from Dr. Emmons, and it's called Nourish, Body, Mind, and Heart. So that's in there as a resource for you. We also have his books are in the back. We have 2 of his books for sale, and then you can look at all of the books. They're in the back here. There's also under resources a list of books that Dr. Emmons recommended. His books are in there, and then our next 2 speakers have recommended. Those are listed in there, and we have copies of all those books in the back that you can look at. We have Dr. Emmons' books today that you can buy. And there's also a really good devotional book that we have available for sale in the back when you're going. And if you're a nurse and you want CEUs, you can get 1.5 hours of CEUs tonight, and there are certificates back there, so you can pick that up at the table over on the east side, so on the left when you're leaving. Also, just look through the book, the binder, you'll see different resources for the next coming classes that we have, and also the schedule for all the classes are listed in the front of the book. So if you have any questions about that, stop me afterwards. We will live stream February 5th, the sleep lecture, and also February 12th, the lecture by Dr. Kristen Bransford on positive psychology. Those will also be live streamed and taped. And next week, I'm really excited, is our book club week, and book club is something that we always do at St. Philip the Deacon. We monthly have book club, and I just happened to pick this year The Blue Zones of Happiness by Dan Buettner, who is also from Minnesota. He's from Brooklyn Center, or Brooklyn Park, close by. He wrote for the National Geographic, but this is his latest book that just came out. We have a few copies of those left, and we'll be discussing that book, and we are so lucky that we have Joel Spoonheim with us, who I was a little shocked when I got an email saying that Joel had actually worked with the Blue Zones. He worked with Dan Buettner, and he will be a moderator with me next week. He helped lead, designed, and implemented the Blue Zones work in communities across the United States, and with Dan Buettner. So he is here tonight. Are you here, Joel? Right here, up front. So he'll be here with me next week to help moderate. He, for the last 5 years, has been with the population's well-being efforts at Park Nicholas, and his knowledge of the Blue Zones is vast, as you can imagine. So we're looking forward to spending some time with him next week. You will get into small groups to answer some of the questions, because this is a lot of people, and we'll probably be in a different room, probably in the fellowship hall. So I look forward to all of you coming to that. If you haven't read the book, that's okay. Some of the information is under Blue Zones in here, and it's under the blue tab, which just happened to work out. Let me see, what else? Look at the binders, and we'll be adding to them every week. And also, we'll start, I'll have one more announcement afterwards, but questions. Anybody have any questions? Dr. Emmons? Did everyone explain? Did he explain everything, all your questions? Anyone? No questions? Oh.
Hello? Oh, I'll be brave and ask a question. So a lot of these 7 things, the practicing, so I'm just thinking about the exercise and the diet and the sleep. Those are really more concrete to work on. But so the other things that you talked about are really fascinating, but how does one go about practicing those things? Like if I get up someday and say, I really want to change that brain path that I have going on. So are there tools to practice some of these things? You see what I'm saying? It's good information, but how do you actually practice these things?
Yeah. So great question. So let's take something like gratitude. Let's just say you want to become a more grateful person. You want to have that feeling, carry that feeling inside. It really does come down to repeating something over and over again, doing it enough times that you're creating a pathway. So I'll give you a concrete example, and there's lots of writing about this and some really good resources. There's actually a book by a guy named Robert Emmons, of all things. He is not related to me that I know of, who has done a lot of the research on how much practicing of gratitude changes your emotions. He's a psychologist. But here's an example. If you were to create a pattern where every single night, when you lay down, before you fell asleep, you were to list 3 things just in your mind 3 things that happened that day that you can feel grateful about. You're bringing attention to it. You're creating an awareness of it. And then you're repeating it over and over again. It becomes a little more powerful probably if you actually do write it down. So, creating some kind of a journaling process or other way of expressing it. So it's not just in your mind, but you're making it somewhat more real. So if you were to do that, and then I think a really beautiful practice, and I should back up and say that I think it's a really good thing to create a baseline practice of some form of meditation, just some form of way of quieting your mind, just as a baseline, which can be as simple as, paying attention to your breathing, repeating a phrase, maybe a short prayer, but something that you're able to create the ability to place your attention where you want it to be. That's just kind of a good baseline. And then, you choose to bring your awareness to something specific. Another great practice is what I call the 3 kindnesses practice. And this is a way of becoming more conscious of kindness around you and within you. So here's what you do. Practice number 1 is to notice when someone is kind to someone else. So you're not part of it, but you've witnessed it. And if you start to really try to notice, you'll see it's happening all the time. You just might not have been aware of it because we're so caught up in our own thoughts. But if you choose to really, really make this an important part of your life, every day you want to notice one act of kindness that someone does to another person. Second thing is you want to notice when someone is kind toward you in some way. So first is someone else being kind to another person. Second is someone being kind to you. And it may be very simple. Maybe they just greeted you warmly. Maybe they gave you something. Maybe they helped you in some way. But if you start to notice, you're going to see it happening a lot more than you thought. And then the third aspect of that is to notice when you are kind to someone else. So then you're bringing it within. Now, in each of these, the only instruction is to notice. You don't have to do anything different. But you'll find that if you start to cultivate that observing and noticing these things, that something does change in you. Your behavior starts to change. Ultimately, we do have to change our actions. But it does start by what is it that we are placing our awareness on. There were a couple of other questions over here, right here. I'll repeat it.
Okay. I noticed in a few of your slides and a few of the things that you said that medications and drugs can be, I don't know if you're leaning towards helpful or not helpful or a long-term solution, or do you see them as kind of a bridge to getting to a place where you can start these practices?
Yep. So the question was about, what about my view on medication? Is it helpful, not helpful? Is it a bridge? So my view is that there are some people who benefit hugely from medication. But it's probably a much smaller percentage than who are actually being given medication. So it's those people that really do have a kind of a long-term, maybe a more genetic-based problem that we call major depression. The other large group of people, and I'm just saying it's 80%, I can't say it's for sure, but it's the majority, don't have that chronic problem. And I think it's a mistake when they go on a medication and stay on it for a long time. I don't think it's necessarily a mistake that they go on the medication as a bridge, as you said, or just as a support for a time. But then they've got to be given the skills so that whatever the stress was that caused that, it's not going to just keep pushing them down. But I hate to see when someone is prescribed a medication and they're on it for years, for something they didn't need to be on for years, and then they have a hard time getting off of it. I hate to see that, and I see it quite a bit. Anybody else? And again, I can probably try to repeat the question.
Could you speak to the impact that screen time has on depression levels in the population now?
Yeah, so what about the impact of screen time on depression and other stress-related problems? So it's, as you might guess, it's a mixed bag. I think there are some very good things that are available now through social media and so forth. I think there are genuinely some good and helpful things. But if you just take it as a whole, I think that there's some real concerns about how young people are viewing themselves and the world through social media, partly because, it's human nature to compare yourself. And you see everybody else on Facebook or whatever seems to be doing so well, and I'm not. Well, how am I going to feel about myself? So I think that's an issue for a lot of people. But I think, too, just the sheer amount of time that is spent in front of a screen, and what does that do? How does that change the brain? One thing is it's not very good for sleep, especially that last hour or two before bed. It's not very good to be in front of a screen, unless it's really a ways away. I think a television set that's a ways away, probably not so bad. But there's a little bit of a flashing, vibrating that you don't see, but your brain senses it. And it's not good for sleep. It doesn't put you in that state that you need to be in to sleep well. So that's a problem. I think, too, that it does have a way of creating more distractibility. I think there's a lot of people now who feel that they have ADHD or something like ADHD. And I think that, in part, it's because of how we relate to screens. For one thing, we're constantly changing our what we're looking at. Our brain is having to shift from one visual to another really rapidly. We're not quite designed for that. So I think, on the whole, it's not helpful. There's some evidence that some of the more violent video games, for example, are really, really hard on those same frontal lobe part of the brain that I was talking about with the monks and meditation. There's evidence that's kind of scary about how how harmful it is to be immersed in a violent sort of video game, the really common ones, and how it's trying to change your brain and keep you in that state of contraction, hostility, self-absorption in ways that can't be good for anybody. Anybody else? Right here.
Have you seen any research that shows that there's a correlation, a hereditary or genetic correlation between chemical imbalance of serotonin that could make you more susceptible to depression?
Is there a genetic, like a deficiency or insufficiency of serotonin? Absolutely. I mean, most of the mental health problems are thought to be about 50% related to genetics, and one of those is to have just a problem with the serotonin system not functioning properly. Probably never has, for that person. Oftentimes it doesn't really show up until after puberty, partly because of how much the hormones interplay with serotonin. But yes, I do believe that that's true for some people.
So if there is that genetic link, is that a reason to be medicated?
So then the question is, does that mean that the person should be medicated? Maybe, but here's the concern about medication, and probably some of you have experienced this, and that is they work beautifully for a year or two, and then they don't. And that's what you don't want to get into, is being on a medication that you can't get off of, but it's no longer working. And I think that the medications, the way they work, are just insufficient. You've got to be doing things to help replenish and help the serotonin system work beyond just what the medication does. It just manipulates things in a way that can be helpful, but isn't always, or isn't always lasting. After a while, your body kind of gets used to it, and it's no longer doing much, and then people end up increasing medication, changing, adding, it gets really complicated. And I think that medications keep working better if people really work on their diet or exercise, because that's another way of supporting the serotonin system. Yes, back here.
Do you think video games are good for your brain?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Do you think video games are good for your brain
Video games?
or not?
Are video games good for your brain or not? Depends on the video game. I think there's a lot of video games out there that are really not good for one's brain. But I also know that there are developers that are trying to create, games that help kids learn in a way that's really fun, or that support some sort of, positive social behavior. They're not all bad, but I think there's a lot of bad ones out there. I'm not a fan of a lot of the more violent video games. I don't think they're good for people's brains, and I don't think they're good for society. Yes.
Question. We have two kids in elementary school, and as I see the world they're growing up in, I'm trying to figure out how as I as a parent can support their growing up to be resilient kids. How do you know of things that are happening within school systems that parents can advocate for? Are there practices that some schools are undertaking that help develop resiliency?
Yeah, so the question is about raising young kids, elementary school kids. Are there things happening in the school system or things that can be done maybe on a bigger scale that will help kids grow up to be more resilient? And absolutely there's things happening. There's a lot of interest in really simple yoga practices, kind of calming breath, simple movement skills. There's a form of it called Yoga Calm, which is, I think, really great. And there's a lot of schools I know of that are doing that and teaching it. Different teachers will learn how to do it. And so there's a big interest in what can be done in schools to help kids. There's, believe it or not, the Goldie Hawn Foundation. You remember Goldie Hawn? She's doing some amazing things for kids, or her foundation is. Really great stuff with curricula, that are designed to really help teachers teach kids simple ways to calm themselves, soothe themselves, stay more present in the classroom, be more connected socially. So there's a lot more that I probably don't know about because I don't really work with kids so much, but I know there's things happening. Maybe one or two more questions, if you've got them. Well, if not, off into the evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Emmons. We really appreciate you being here. He does have books. There's books out there if anybody wants to buy them. And also the book, The Blue Zones of Happiness, that we're doing next week. And if everybody, we have a giveaway or a takeaway every week. And this week you'll get this card on the way out with this beautiful picture and a lovely verse on it and a prayer on the back. You'll get a sleep aid when we do sleep. And some of the practices he talked about, and that was a great question about how that's one of the things that positive psychologists are finding, that you have to practice it. So that's why we have our workshop night, the 5th night. We will be practicing things that can help you change your brain. Chris Bransford, also in hers, the gratitude practice he talked about is in the book Love 2.0 by Fredrickson, and that book is out there if you want to look at it. That we will be looking at and practicing. I think Chris will be talking about that one also. So she will be giving you some tools like that on February 12th, and on February 5th we will what he said, sleep, learning about sleep, and we will be giving you a free sleep aid. So we're looking forward to having you all next week, and come back. And if you have any questions, email me, and have a great day and enjoy the beautiful snow.